I first moved to the state of Washington in 1991, I was told, gotta get involved with the Elwha Dam removal project. It's gonna happen any year now. So 20 years later, it's actually happening.
8,000 salmon were released into a river that everyone had already written off as dead. Canadian scientists were confident they knew how it would play out. They were wrong.
When a river system like the Elwha is deprived of salmon, the fundamental shape and diversity of the ecosystem really changes.
What followed caught researchers off guard and forced biologists to rethink how rivers recover after collapse.
The thing that's amazing about summer steelhead in the Elwha is that they were trapped for 100 years as rainbow trout above the dam.
This wasn't a simple success story or a failure. It became something far stranger, revealing how unpredictable nature can be when it's given a second chance. The $325 million bet on a river. The Elwha River in Washington state did not die all at once. Its decline stretched over decades, slowly fading after concrete walls cut it off from the Pacific Ocean. The first dam went up in 1910. The second followed in 1927. Together, they transformed one of the richest salmon rivers on the West Coast into a controlled channel for paper mills and hydroelectric power. Before the dams, more than 400,000 salmon pushed upstream every year. All 5 Pacific salmon species returned. Some Chinook grew so massive that local Indigenous communities called them Tai, meaning chief, because a single fish could weigh more than 100 pounds and fill an entire canoe. The dams made those journeys impossible. The Elwha Dam stood 108 feet high. Glines Canyon Dam towered 210 feet. Between them, 70 miles of cold, clean spawning habitat were cut off. Gravel beds stayed untouched. Deep pools held no young fish. Fast runs carried nothing upstream. By the 1990s, fewer than 3,000 salmon returned annually, and not a single one could pass the first wall of concrete. When salmon vanished, the river system unraveled. Bears lost a major food source. Bald eagles stopped appearing on schedule. River otters disappeared. Insects that fed on decaying fish vanished. Then the birds that hunted those insects. Then the predators that fed on those birds. The ecosystem slowly collapsed over almost 90 years, piece by piece, until the damage was complete. In 2011, the United States government approved a plan no one had ever attempted at this scale. No ladders, no bypass channels, no partial fixes. Full removal. It became the largest dam removal project ever approved, with a final cost of $325 million. Crews brought explosives, excavators, and sediment control systems. When the first sections broke in September 2011, more than 24 million cubic yards of trapped sediment surged downstream, enough to fill Seattle's football stadium 15 times. The Strait of Juan de Fuca ran brown for months. Helicopter footage made it look like the river had exploded, and even supporters worried they had unleashed something uncontrollable. Then the sediment settled, the water cleared. By 2014, both dams were gone, buried and broken. For the first time since 1910, the Elwha flowed freely from Olympic National Park to the Pacific Ocean. The river was open again, but it was empty. Salmon rely on early life imprinting, chemical cues, magnetic fields, and sky patterns learned as juveniles. These fish had been gone for 3 full generations. No memory remained. No guides existed. The gravel beds were there, the pools waiting, but no one knew how to use them. That was when a call came from Canada. Scientists had questions, but more importantly, they had a theory that seemed impossible. This river could bring salmon home without ever teaching them the way. How could fish find a river they had never swum in, guided only by instincts passed down from ancestors who had been gone for 90 years? And if it worked, what did that mean for rivers everywhere, waiting for life to return? Canadian scientists get reckless. Canadian fishery scientists had been watching the Elwha River for years because British Columbia faced the same problem. Old dams, rivers collapsing, salmon runs disappearing, and ecosystems unraveling. For 20 years, these Canadians did something that made older American biologists nervous. They moved salmon into rivers the fish had never seen, forcing them to start over, learn, and find new homes from scratch. Traditional science said this was impossible. Salmon imprinting theory suggested baby salmon memorized the chemical makeup of their birth river, the pH, minerals, microbes, and every smell, during a tiny window of early life. After years at sea, adults followed invisible cues, magnetic fields, even the sun, returning to spawn exactly where they hatched. Move them to a new river, critics said, and the fish would vanish, return to old hatcheries, or die. American scientists called the Canadian method reckless. Journals warned of genetic pollution and the extinction of transplanted populations. One paper in the Journal of Fish Biology predicted complete failure. The young salmon would not survive in water chemistry they had never experienced. But the Canadians had decades of hard data. More than 40 relocation experiments between 1990 and 2010. Some failed spectacularly, others exceeded expectations. When rivers matched in temperature, flow, gravel, elevation, and ocean distance, relocated salmon thrived. Return rates reached 15 to 20%, far higher than wild populations could manage naturally. Dr. Andrew Trites at the University of British Columbia led this work. His research proved salmon were not rigid. They could learn new rivers using magnetic fields, sun position, and multiple olfactory learning windows. Salmon were like living GPS units, flexible and adaptable, capable of surviving what old models said was impossible. When the Elwha dams came down in 2011 and 2012, Dr. Trites made a bold proposal to NOAA Fisheries and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Release 8,000 juvenile Chinook into a river empty for 90 years, a river none of these fish had ever seen. American scientists were stunned. One NOAA official said, "You're wasting 8,000 fish and embarrassing us all." Political stakes were high. Hydropower companies, paper mills, farmers, and Congress watched closely. Standard projects are expected to yield maybe 1% return. That meant 10,000 fish might bring back only 100. Failure could end future funding and make every ecological restoration effort politically toxic. The Elwha, on paper, shared key traits with successful Canadian relocation rivers: cold, clean water, intact gravel beds, seasonal flow patterns, but it had been dead for generations. Permits were granted in early 2012, with strict rules: 5 years to show results, or the experiment ended forever. 8,000 fish, no memory, one empty river. Could they survive the ocean and find a river their ancestors had abandoned decades ago? The stakes were enormous, the science uncertain, and the eyes of the world were watching. If these salmon failed, it could confirm centuries of assumptions about ecological fragility. If they succeeded, it would rewrite what we understood about resilience, adaptation, and the limits of life itself. So the question loomed: could a river forgotten for 90 years really remember the fish it had lost, or was this experiment destined to fail? Elwha River salmon release, spring 2012. Spring 2012. The upper Elwha River, 35 miles from the Pacific Ocean, ran clear and cold for the first time in 90 years. Gravel beds that had not felt the touch of spawning salmon since Woodrow Wilson was president stretched for miles, glistening under the morning sun. On a crisp April morning, researchers lined the riverbanks holding tanks filled with 8,000 juvenile Chinook salmon, their silver bodies flickering in the sunlight. These fish were not the original Elwha residents. The native populations had been gone for generations, wiped out by the Elwha and Glines Canyon dams built in 1910 and 1927. The juveniles came from 4 different hatcheries: Qualicum and Nanaimo rivers on Vancouver Island in Canada, and Dungeness and Skokomish rivers on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. Scientists chose them carefully to maximize genetic diversity, selecting fish with traits suited to the cold, clean waters, flow patterns, and gravel sizes of the old Elwha. Each fish measured 4 to 5 inches in the smolt stage. When bodies and gills shift for life in saltwater, their scales shimmered silver with dark spots, and they had begun moving from territorial behaviors to schooling, a shift necessary for the long downstream journey. The release was carefully planned. Fish were spread across multiple sites over 2 weeks: gravel bars, tributaries, and side pools, to mimic natural emergence. Every riffle, bend, pool, and temperature change was meant to imprint the river's chemical signature into their memory. Then the juveniles vanished, swept into currents beginning a 1,000-mile journey to the Pacific, leaving researchers with notes, cameras, and a long wait. Chinook salmon follow predictable life cycles. Juveniles spend roughly 1 year in freshwater before heading to the ocean for 2 to 4 years, feeding on herring, sardines, and other forage fish while avoiding orcas, seals, sea lions, sharks, and commercial fishing nets. Survival rates are brutal. Only 2 to 3 out of 100 make it back. 1% would have been optimistic for these first 8,000 fish, just 80 adults returning. Then 2014 arrived. Early, but crews spotted large adults pushing upstream, 20 to 30 pounds, swimming in stretches of the river unseen by salmon for nearly a century. 10, 50, hundreds appeared. By the end of the season, over 800 adults returned, 10 times the expectations. Numbers were confirmed using weirs, sonar, and motion-sensing cameras. Fall 2015 brought the main wave of 4-year-olds. Thousands swam upstream. By November, more than 3,000 adult Chinook had returned. a 37.5% return rate. Modern hatcheries celebrate 5%, wild populations 2 to 3%, and even historic peaks rarely exceeded 15%. Salmon had reclaimed a river no living generation had seen, one dead for 3 generations. Models, predictions, and decades of biological assumptions were shattered, and yet, as researchers watched the river flood with life, one unsettling question lingered. If these salmon returned in numbers so far beyond all expectations, had the river brought back the same salmon that had left, or had something entirely new emerged from the water? Fishes rewrite 3 generations' DNA. The salmon returning to the Elwha River were not supposed to be any different from the fish that left decades earlier. Evolution usually takes thousands or millions of generations. Darwin's finches took decades to change beak sizes in response to food supply, and peppered moths in industrial England shifted color over multiple generations. Change is normally slow, but sometimes it happens fast. Dr. Mara Zimmerman, a geneticist leading the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's Elwha monitoring program, noticed something remarkable almost immediately. The adult Chinook coming back were far larger than expected. Source populations of 4-year-olds from Dungeness, Skokomish, Qualicum, and Nanaimo rivers averaged about 22 to 25 pounds. The Elwha returns averaged 28 to 32 pounds, a 20 to 30% increase in just one generation. That is enormous for salmon biology. Size matters. Bigger females lay more eggs. Bigger males dominate fights for mates. Larger fish can dig deeper nests in gravel beds, securing the best spots for eggs to survive. Bigger fish produce stronger offspring with higher chances of reaching the ocean and returning. In the Elwha, the river itself had become a selective force, rewarding size and strength over speed or stealth. Zimmerman's team collected fin clips from returning adults and sent them to genetic labs for analysis. The results were astonishing. Elwha salmon showed measurable genetic differences from their source populations. They were still Chinook, but allele frequencies had shifted across multiple genes. Traits linked to growth rate, migration timing, stress response, predator avoidance, and thermal tolerance all showed rapid selection. The river, combined with the long migration from ocean to spawning grounds, was acting like a natural evolutionary filter, speeding up adaptation far beyond what textbooks suggested. Run timing was even more surprising. Salmon usually return at very specific weeks each year, honed over thousands of generations. Dungeness River Chinook return in September, Skokomish in October and November, Qualicum and Nanaimo in August and September. Elwha salmon returned over 5 months, from July through November. Some arrived earlier than any source fish, some later. Expanding the season spread risk against unpredictable river conditions. Warm August waters might kill early spawners, while storms in September could wipe out some nests, but the population as a whole survived. How could this happen so quickly? 4 source stocks brought genetic diversity. Ocean survival filtered the weakest. Novel conditions in the recovering river, a shifting, unpredictable environment, accelerated adaptation. In just 3 generations, these salmon were not simply surviving. They were becoming Elwha salmon, bigger, timed differently, genetically distinct, and suited to a river that had been dead for 90 years. Yet genetics was only half the story. Thousands of returning fish spawned and died, releasing tons of ocean nutrients into a river long starved of life. Dead fish feed entire ecosystems. Streams, forests, insects, birds, and bears all depend on those nutrients. Could this sudden influx of nutrients bring a long empty forest and river system back to life? And what happens when salmon return in numbers, sizes, and behaviors nobody could have predicted, reshaping the river in ways no scientist could have imagined? Dead fish builds a forest and engineers a river. Pacific salmon die after spawning. Unlike Atlantic salmon, which can reproduce multiple times, Pacific salmon are simulporous. They spawn once and then die. Every adult follows the same pattern. Their bodies start breaking down immediately. Their immune systems fail, their flesh softens, and they grow gaunt and ragged. Indigenous peoples have long had names for this stage, roughly translating to ghost fish or death swimmers, reflecting the way the salmon fade from life as they complete their journey. This death is far from wasted. Each adult Chinook weighs between 20 and 40 pounds and is packed with nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and trace minerals collected over years in the Pacific Ocean. When they die along riverbanks or in shallow streams, scavengers, decomposers, and nutrient cycles recycle that biomass into the surrounding ecosystem. Scientists call this a salmon subsidy, a massive transfer of nutrients from ocean to land. In healthy rivers, salmon runs deliver hundreds of tons of nutrients each year, essentially acting as free commercial fertilizer. Studies in Alaska measured up to 500 kilograms of nitrogen per kilometer of stream annually, directly boosting growth in trees and plants near rivers. The Elwha River's forests had been starving for almost 90 years. Between 1927, when Glines Canyon Dam was completed, and 2012, no salmon swam upstream. Trees were smaller, canopies thinner, and understories sparse. The soil lacked nutrients. When thousands of salmon began returning after the dam removals, dying along riverbanks, the forest began waking up. By 2015, researchers led by Dr. Sarah Morley at the NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center measured ocean-derived nitrogen in trees that had not seen it since before World War I. The effects cascaded quickly. Insects feeding on carcasses or aquatic larvae exploded in number. Birds returned, bald eagles, ravens, American dippers, and gulls, all drawn by new food sources. Mammals followed. Black bears, previously scarce, fed on carcasses, with trail cameras recording dozens every day. River otters, mink, raccoons, and coyotes joined in. Each animal spread nutrients further, moving marine nitrogen throughout the watershed in ways the fish alone could not. Salmon also reshape rivers. Female Chinook dig nests called redds, moving gravel and sediment to create depressions for eggs. Each female digs between 5 and 10 redds, and thousands of fish doing this yearly move enormous amounts of gravel and cobble. This loosens compacted riverbeds, sorts sediment, and creates channel complexity. Pools deepen, riffles form, and side channels appear. By 2016, Upper Elwha's channel complexity had increased by 40% compared to pre-dam conditions, according to field surveys using sonar mapping and drone footage. More habitat meant higher juvenile survival, more returning adults, more redds, and further river reshaping. The salmon were not just living in the river, they were rebuilding it. Forests and rivers revived themselves through the bodies of dead fish, feeding not just life, but the very structure of the ecosystem. If the bodies of dead fish can restore entire forests, rivers, and complex ecosystems in just a few years, why did Western science insist this was impossible for decades? And how could the knowledge of indigenous peoples, who had observed these patterns for generations, be ignored for over a century, while the river itself quietly proved what everyone said could not happen? Indigenous prophecy nobody believed. For more than 100 years, the lower Elwha Klallam tribe said the same thing. Remove the dams, and the salmon will come back. Not maybe, not possibly, they said they would return. Elders spoke in the 1920s when the second dam went up, warning that the river could not be blocked without disaster. They repeated it in the 1960s when environmentalists first questioned the impacts of dams, again in the 1990s when removal became technically possible, and yet again in 2011 when demolition finally began. Western scientists mostly ignored these warnings. They had models, peer-reviewed papers, and decades of collected data. Elders had stories, traditions, and knowledge passed through generations. From a Western perspective, the two weren't equal. Stories weren't data, tradition wasn't evidence. Yet the elders were right about everything, and the river itself would eventually prove it. The lower Elwha Klallam have lived at the river's mouth for thousands of years. Their entire culture revolves around salmon. Chinook, coho, sockeye, pink, and chum. Each species had specific preparation methods, ceremonial roles, and ecological significance. This knowledge wasn't abstract. It was tested and refined through centuries of observation. They knew the river's pulse, the timing of the runs, and the ways salmon shaped the forests, wetlands, and streams upstream. When dams went up in 1910 and 1927, the tribe protested and filed legal challenges, all dismissed. They appealed to the federal government, which sided with builders. Salmon disappeared almost overnight. Children grew up never seeing the massive runs their grandparents described. Stories became abstract, memories blurred, and young people doubted elders. Perhaps the salmon numbers were exaggerated. Perhaps the runs were never that big. Some elders refused to relent. The salmon remember. They're written into the water. If we remove the dams, they'll come back.
Regardless of what you feel about ecosystem restoration and removing the dams for the fish, just the lifespan of these concrete structures is coming to an end,
They said. Not metaphorical, literally. They meant that salmon carry knowledge of the river across generations. Western biology had no framework for this. Salmon imprinting theory suggested memory lasted only as long as living fish passed it on. Remove fish for 3 generations, and memory is gone. But the elders were describing a deeper connection. Population level and landscape level adaptation, what modern ecologists call evolutionary memory. Canadian scientists designing the Elwha experiment initially relied on research about salmon navigation, imprinting, and plasticity. They did not consult the tribe at first. Yet when returns in 2014 and 2015 far exceeded expectations, thousands of adult Chinook swimming up rivers empty for 90 years, conversations changed. Researchers asked, what did the elders know that we didn't? Tribal knowledge contradicted Western models. Salmon could adapt to new rivers. Salmon runs could rebound fast. Salmon could reshape rivers, not just live in them. By 2015, the tribe held a ceremonial fishery, the first in nearly 100 years. Elders quietly said, "We told you." Salmon were back. Rivers were healing. But the world had changed. Climate warming pushed summer water temperatures higher. Ocean acidification altered food webs. Development pressures threatened riparian zones. The dams were gone, the fish had returned, but the river now received 90 years' worth of nutrients in just 5. Could the ecosystem handle that much life that fast? Could a river recover when abundance itself became a shock? The question hung over everyone watching the Elwha. If the salmon returned, thriving beyond all expectations, what else might nature be capable of once we finally get out of the way? Elwha River Revival 2017. By 2017, 5 years after the first salmon releases, the Elwha River was overflowing with success, messy, chaotic, and more than anyone expected.
In the case of Chinook salmon, it was literally within days of the final blast. The first fish were observed upstream within.
Thousands of adult Chinook were dying on the banks, their bodies packed with nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and trace minerals from years at sea. For a river that had gone 90 years without this nutrient input, it was like a starving person suddenly being given an all-you-can-eat buffet. The forest, wetlands, and aquatic life gorged themselves, and with gorging came problems nobody fully predicted. By late summer, researchers noticed algae covering rocks in thick green mats. Water that had been crystal clear looked murky. Normally, algae blooms signal pollution sewage, fertilizer runoff, but here the cause was the salmon themselves. Nutrients from dead fish fueled the blooms. Algae produce oxygen during the day, but at night they consume it. Dissolved oxygen in pools drop to 5 or 6 milligrams per liter at night. Stressful for juvenile salmon, but not fatal. Scientists measured these low oxygen events using continuous data loggers deployed alongside channels and riffles, confirming the river was adapting to the sudden nutrient surge. The ecosystem adjusted unevenly because nature does not shift smoothly. It lurches, overshoots, and corrects. By 2018, algae blooms shrank as insect populations exploded. Mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies multiplied, grazing on the algae and helping the river process nutrients naturally. Meanwhile, commercial and recreational fishermen complained that too many salmon were being wasted by deaths upstream. Chinook catches in the Strait of Juan de Fuca dropped about 15% in 2015 and 2016. Conservationists warned of long-term benefits, but short-term economic losses strained local communities reliant on fishing. Hatchery managers also worried about genetic mixing. The Elwha salmon were a mix of wild and hatchery stocks coming from Dungeness, Skokomish, Qualicum, and Nanaimo rivers. Some feared reduced fitness or higher disease susceptibility. So far, the population thrived, but ongoing monitoring remained critical. Water temperature added another challenge. Summer temperatures in the Elwha reached 20 degrees Celsius, near the upper limit for Chinook juveniles. Ocean conditions shifted unpredictably due to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and El Niño cycles, affecting plankton availability, forage fish abundance, and salmon survival. The first cohorts had luck on their side, but future salmon could face heat waves similar to the 2014 to 2016 blob that devastated marine life along the west coast. Despite the chaos, the Elwha's revival inspired the world. By 2015, 91 dam removal projects cited it as proof of concept. Europe removed over 6,000 barriers in 2 decades, restoring salmon runs and river connectivity.
And by 2014, the river was able to flow freely again. The Elwha and its former reservoirs became a unique laboratory.
The Klamath River Project in California and Oregon modeled its work on the Elwha, consulting indigenous tribes and carefully monitoring recolonization. Restoration economics exceeded expectations. Tourism around Port Angeles jumped 20%, property values rose up to 20%, and every dollar invested returned 3 to 4 times in ecosystem services, recreation, and fisheries benefits. The Elwha shows nature's resilience, but it also raises new questions. Can rivers everywhere recover this fast when climate change, pollution, and human pressures intensify? Could rapid nutrient surges trigger long-term imbalances in other ecosystems? And after thousands of salmon transformed a dead river into a thriving, complex system in just a few years? What does this tell us about our ability to undo centuries of ecological damage? And are we ready to try it on a global scale? Elwha River Revival, 2024. By 2024, the Elwha River was defying every expectation. 5th-generation salmon, great-great-grandchildren of the 8,000 fish released in 2012, were spawning in gravel beds their ancestors had built. Natural reproduction kept the run stable and growing without extra hatchery support. Salmon appeared in tributaries that hadn't seen fish in over a century, pushing into headwater streams once thought too steep, too narrow, or too shallow for spawning. They were spreading, exploring, claiming every available habitat, and turning empty streams into bustling ecosystems. The forest rebounded with equal energy. Trees grew faster, understories filled in, and birds stayed abundant. Black bears were spotted feeding along the river daily, spreading nutrients further from carcasses. Ambient sound recordings captured a richer mix of calls, rustles, and splashes. Acoustic complexity had increased sharply compared with pre-dam decades. The river itself transformed. Side channels appeared and disappeared with seasonal flows. Gravel bars shifted, riffles sharpened, and pools deepened. The Elwha no longer resembled the simplified, straightened river of 2010. It looked wild, messy, chaotic in the way healthy rivers always do.
And restoration efforts like the Elwha River restoration are key examples of resilience building, and they're positive stories.
For decades, conservation biology assumed ecosystems were fragile. Disturbances caused irreversible damage, and recovery, if it happened at all, took centuries. The Elwha told a different story. Ecosystems are built to recover. Wildfires burn forests, floods scour rivers, droughts stress populations, volcanoes sterilize landscapes, and life returns. Resilience is not luck. It is evolution preparing systems for disruption. The critical factor was removing obstacles. The dams blocked access to 70 miles of spawning habitat and trapped sediment for decades. Take them out, and the river began to heal itself. No one reconstructed historical conditions, micromanaged species, or dictated which plants should grow where. Natural processes resumed, restoring function faster than any model predicted. The Canadian fishery teams and the lower Elwha Clallam elders embraced uncertainty. They understood salmon homing isn't rigid. The elders had long observed salmon behavior, passing knowledge through generations. Written into the water wasn't a story. It was a precise observation encoded over centuries. When the first 8,000 Chinook were released, they didn't just survive. They returned in numbers far beyond expectations, proving adaptability at a scale Western science hadn't predicted. Rapid salmon adaptation challenged assumptions about evolution. Selection pressures and genetic diversity allowed measurable changes in years, not millennia. Fish returned larger, timed their migrations differently, and survived in unpredictable streams. Similar dynamics are now seen globally as species confront climate change, habitat loss, and human disturbance. Restoration economics reinforce that ecological gains aren't just environmental, they are political and financial. Tourism near Port Angeles grew by 20%, property values rose nearly 20%, and every restoration dollar returned $3 to $4 through ecosystem services, recreation, and fisheries. Yet success also brought challenges. Algae blooms stressed young salmon in some pools, fisheries conflicts arose as catches temporarily dropped, and warming water continues to threaten long-term stability. Restoration does not recreate historical ecosystems. It creates new, functional, resilient systems adapted to present-day conditions. The 8,000 salmon were more than fish. They were catalysts, rebuilding forests, reshaping rivers, reviving watersheds, and proving ecosystems respond when given space and opportunity. If a single river and a few thousand fish could undo decades of damage in less than a decade, what other broken rivers, forests, and coasts could we fix? What hidden resilience waits in ecosystems around the world, silently ready to rebound? If humans step aside and let nature work its quiet, unstoppable magic? Thanks for watching. Please click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.